So Agile is a way to address some of those problems because you, instead of having this rigid process with contracts and requirements agreed to ahead of time, you have an initial set of requirements that you agree to with the client, and then they're always up to be modified all along the way. And so you do development in what are referred to as sprints, which is some agreed to amount of time with the team and with the client, generally 1 to 2 weeks. And at the end of each sprint, you have something delivered that's testable and verifiable by the client that meets some requirement. It might be a small requirement, and the client gives you feedback on that thing, and based on that feedback you may decide to change something else that was going to be delivered later. And so you stay open to things changing. And so some of the benefits are that you're always working with these sort of manageable chunks of code. So you're always working on code that's in testable chunks, and they can be completed in a short amount of time, and every chunk that you add adds some value to the end solution. It helps you to focus on the work that really needs to be done without getting distracted or going down rabbit holes. So it's really easy as a developer. You may have found that it's really easy to do what I call going down rabbit holes, which is you start working on something and maybe you have to do some research about something that you're working on. It happens even for seasoned developers. You know, you're like, I'm not really sure the best way to do this. And so then you go Google some things or maybe YouTube some things, and then you're like, ooh, that's really cool. I never thought about doing that. That would make this so much cooler. I'm going to do that. And then so you start to add this other thing that you hadn't even thought about before. And in the process of doing that, you realize, oh, I'm not really sure how to do this bit of it now. And you go look something else up and you're like, oh, that's cool. This is what we need to add. This would be awesome. And you start to add this other thing, and then before you know it, the week is over and you haven't delivered what you said you're going to deliver. So having things really broken down and well defined in small chunks can help to avoid that. It doesn't prevent it completely, but it does help to avoid. It just keeps you kind of focused on something that can be completed in a short amount of time. When you develop with an Agile methodology, you meet regularly, daily, typically, or sometimes multiple times a day, depending on how you're working together as a team. Now, what is the team? It may be just the developers, but when you work on a team in a real-world scenario, it would also include the testers. So you have development engineers and test engineers that both work on development of the product. And the development engineers and the test engineers would meet every day and talk about what's been done today, what got done yesterday, what are the blockers, so what's stopping me from getting work done. Sometimes there are blockers because of something like an environment's not up. Maybe a database server's down or something like that, and that's a blocker. Sometimes blockers are dependencies. Maybe the piece that you're working on as a developer depends on another piece of work being done, and that piece of work isn't done yet. And so you're blocked until that piece of work is done. So when you come up against blockers, you talk together as a team to see what can we do to get past this blocker, and until we get past this blocker, what else can we do with our time so that we're still being productive. So if something is halted because of a dependency, then you make sure that what you're depending on is being worked on and that everyone has an understanding about when it should be done. And then you say, okay, well, this developer that's waiting on that dependency, what else can they do right now? They can pick up another piece of work and work on that until the dependency is met. So if you meet and talk in a stand-up daily, then it generally results in you being more productive. Now, these stand-ups should be short. They should be really short. You should take just a couple of minutes per person talking unless there's something up for discussion. So it's just to keep everybody working together, and so that you don't sit with a problem by yourself and not be productive, so that you can work together to get through those things and everybody stays productive every day. You also want to meet weekly with all the stakeholders, and that means with the client. So if you're working in a large organization, that's generally not going to be the customer directly. It's going to be somebody like a product owner or product manager. So the product managers would have been interfacing with the clients. They have a good understanding of what the client wants and what's been promised to the client. And the product manager there would act as the client stakeholder. And so once a week generally, or once a sprint, it might be once every 2 weeks, you meet with all stakeholders and talk about what's been accomplished. You do a demo of the things that have been done, and you get feedback from all stakeholders about what's been done to check in, to make sure that you're delivering what they want. And what's been agreed upon, because even if you define things in design documents and charts, it still might not be clear. There still might be misconceptions or misinterpretations, or not but differences in the way that things are perceived and interpreted. And also with Agile methodology, there's a focus on flexibility and on doing the work of coding versus documentation. So the documentation isn't meant to be fully fleshed out, not with every detail in the documentation. In Agile, we don't do that. In Waterfall, we do. In Waterfall, we write very detailed, low-level designs with APIs defined and behavior defined of functions and all of that stuff. With Agile, you don't take the time to do that. You loosely design things, and then you work on the code, but that means that it's much more likely that you have differences in understanding, different perceptions about what was agreed upon, because it's not written down at a very low level. So that's why it's important once a week or once a sprint. Now in a 3-week project, it better be at least once a week that you get back together with your stakeholder and say, this is what we've done. Does this look right to you? And then if the stakeholder says, oh yeah, that is actually what I asked for, but well, now that I'm looking at it, we really need to be able to do this too. How is the user going to be able to tell what they ordered last week or last month or whatever? How are they going to be able to see that? We need a way for them to see that. Or I don't want everybody to be able to edit this particular thing, so we need to make sure that only this kind of user can edit that. They might come back with things that even they didn't think about when they actually sit and look at the working prototype or the demo of what you've got done. So the idea is that you're meeting regularly, and regularly will depend upon the timeline of your project. So in a project that's taking 3 months to develop, you might do that once every 2 weeks or once a week. In a project that's taking 6 months to develop, you might do it less often than that. So it sort of depends on the scale of your project timeline as to how often those meetings happen. But the deal is that you want it to happen frequently enough that you have time to incorporate feedback and make changes so that what you deliver ultimately is what the client wants. So in the Agile methodology, it's more important to make code that works, that meets the client's needs, than to have complete documentation or having everything agreed upon up front with no deviation. So there's some resource links that I put there that you can read up on later. So there's one about there's a link to Trello. There's some stuff here from Atlassian, I think that's how you pronounce the name of that company, about Agile, which is Agile is just another tool that's used for tracking work. It's a ticketing system that has a lot of capability for Agile programming. So there are different views presented in Jira for different types of stakeholders. So there's the developers sort of tools in Jira, the testers sort of tools in Jira, and the product management and executive tools. So there's different ways to look at the work that's being done depending on who's looking and why they need to see that information. In Jira, there's some really good workflow capability built in. So you can build in workflow in the way that you manage your tickets and the way you process your tickets to make sure that people are following the right steps and the right things are being done. There's a way to estimate the work, that the time it's going to take to do work, to assign it at a granular level, to tie it up with the code repository that you're using so that those two things are connected. There are ways to do burn down charts in Jira, which is a way to see how much work has been done at the level of the sprint at the view from a particular developer, and how much work there is left to be done. So it just has a lot of capability built in, but it's a licensed tool and it's not cheap. So usually large corporations will use Jira. At SAP we use Jira. A lot of smaller companies will use something like Trello, a paid version of Trello, because the licenses are cheaper and it's functional enough. There's a lot that you can do with paid versions of Trello. So there's some links that you can look at there, but I just want to go through some sort of basic steps, and then we're going to look at Trello together, and I'll suggest some ways that you can use Trello for your project to incorporate Agile methodology into what you're doing. For your Term 3 project, you're going to, one or two of the criteria are related to Agile, using Agile methodology, so it's something you're going to be graded on. At least some of the criteria are based on that. But besides that, I really do think that following these practices makes it more likely that you're successful in completing the project. And besides that, I think that it's very useful to have an understanding of these practices before you go either work for yourself or work for someone else, because you'll see these practices used today very widely. I don't know of companies. What I've seen and what I've heard is that when companies don't use Agile, that then things tend to be a bit chaotic, and developers feel more isolated in what they're doing, and there are a lot of surprises at the end, and a lot of things not getting done the way that you wanted them to, and the kind of negative feelings that go with that. And what I've also heard from people who work with teams with very well-established Agile practices is that it's really enjoyable to work in teams like that, because you always feel like you know what you're doing and what you're supposed to be doing, and everyone always understands what's going on and what's getting done. So I do think it's in your best interest to use it, to practice it with this Term 3 assignment, really practice it and get some feedback about it. So you've met with your client and you understand what you want to provide. You've got a basic initial scope and definition defined with the client, understanding that this can and will most likely change throughout the life of the project. But you've got an initial sort of stake in the ground. This is what we're going to do, and this is what you're asking us for. So once you've done that, you'll break your work into larger categories first. So you've got these sort of like large overarching stories or pieces of function that have to be provided by your app. So in what we were talking about this morning, Keto, you've got the supplier side of things and you've got the vendor side of things. And so those are sort of like really large categories. And then you look at one of those large categories and you break it into smaller stories until you get down, and you break it down and you break it down. And in this process, you're doing things like, drawing up your ERDs and flow charts, and you're thinking through user stories and scenarios. And you work through that until you get to the point that you've got chunks that are small enough for a developer to complete in what you decide on as a sprint. So a sprint is a period of time. In a 3-week project, I would make this, the longest I would make a sprint is a week. And you might even make it smaller than that. You might make it 3 days or something like that. So you have to talk as a team about that and decide what period of time should your sprint be. So the things you want to think about is you should be able, as a developer, to get something productive done in that period of time, okay? Something that can be, with the work done by all developers, you get something done that can be displayed back to the client that you can show. And say, okay, look, this is what we've got done. How is this looking to you? Do you have any comments about it, any feedback about it? So you don't want it to be so short that you can't do that, but you don't want it to be so long that you don't have enough time to incorporate feedback. So I've never worked with a sprint cycle that was shorter than a week, but I can imagine on a small project that maybe you might want to make it 3 days. That might be something that you think about. So let's say that you have a sprint period of 3 days. So you want to break your user stories into chunks that can be completed by, like, fully completed. When I say completed, I mean it's fleshed out, it's coded, it's tested and reviewed in that period of time. Okay? So not just writing the code for it in 3 days, but the code's written, you've tested it, which means you've written tests for it, and it's been reviewed by your peers in that period of time. So that's how small you want these user stories to be. Okay? So you break things down into those chunks as much as you can at the start. Again, there's this continual feedback loop, and you'll find that, oh, okay, maybe we don't need this piece, or this piece is less important now, so we're going to move it into the backlog. And you might find, oh, we didn't even think about this, we need to add this too, and so you might be adding user stories as you go along too, but you can only start with what you can start with. So you start with what you can think of at the front, you break it down you break it down into those small chunks. So you break it down, and then you put time estimates on it. So you say this piece of code should take 1 day, or you could break it down even further, and you can say this piece should take 1 day, the writing of the code should take 2 hours, the writing of the test cases should take 1 hour, Go ahead. Yeah, so test-driven development is a good idea. It has a lot of benefits. At least some of the testing should be done that way, I think. So it's a good idea, because then you've got at least basic unit testing done before you start. That piece of it is done with the development. So that's a smart thing to do for the reasons we've talked about, I'm sure, so far with test-driven development. So you are thinking about testing all along, and it's not an afterthought, which is always a bad idea. You are more focused on what your code actually has to do and the corner cases you have to think about as you're writing the code. So it keeps you more focused, I think, on what you need to work on, and prevents going down the rabbit hole sometimes when you do that. And then you've got a set of tests that you can integrate with some tools. We'll talk about that maybe another day, and that you can run every time that before you commit code changes. So it prevents regression. So it prevents you from introducing code that breaks things that worked yesterday or last week. So I think it's a good idea to do that. You're not going to get full test coverage that way, and you're not expected to, but I do think that you should write some tests before you start writing any code to test basic functionality and prevent basic regressions. So you break up your work into stories, small stories, and you estimate how much time those stories are going to take. And then step two, you prioritize and estimate. So you estimate how long it's going to take to complete these small tasks, and then you prioritize them. So you do that up front with everything you know. So this is really important for the MVP. This is medium importance. This is really low importance. And then you focus on the really high important stuff first. So as you prioritize, and I'll show you this in Trello in a minute, you'll list things in an order of priority. Maybe you add in a label. So in Jira, there's actually there's a priority flag. So you set a priority flag to indicate priority. There's a time estimate field, so you set the time estimate in that field. But in Trello, we can kind of mimic that. With free Trello, we can mimic that in a couple of ways that I'll show you. So maybe I'll just show you that now while we're talking. So in Trello, what I've done is I've represented a workflow with my Trello board. Instead of representing sort of different user story categories, I'm representing workflow with these columns. So I've got a backlog column. Everything starts in a backlog. And I've got a to-do. So these are the things that we're going to commit to as a team to put in the MVP. And then we've got an in progress. So these are the things that people are actively working on right now. And then things that are in review. So once something is done, somebody completes it, they they commit it, and they push it probably in our case. In some places you'll see that they don't actually do a push until review's been done, and it just depends on how you're working. But probably what you'll do is you'll commit and push, and then it'll be reviewed. But you'll review each other's work, and then when it's all reviewed and it's all tested, then you can put it in the done category. And so what's in the done category is something that you can show to the client. You could add another category here that says like approved or something if you wanted to, but it's probably not necessary for a project of this size. So everything starts in backlog. And what I've done here is that I've created a label that indicates priority, and I've created a label that indicates a sort of user story category. Now, I would probably use the word epic, but that's a Jira kind of word. So an epic is like a large overarching story, and within an epic you'll have smaller stories. So I've used labels here to indicate sort of what big story this small piece of work is associated with. And so you could use labels that way in Trello, and I would suggest you do that. You might use them in a different way too, but this is one way that you can use labels. Now in Trello, do you guys know how to create a team? Do you know how to have a team for a particular board?
How do you got your Git commits in that?
I'll show you.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, I'll show you. So Trello comes with this power-ups ability, and with the free version you can only enable one power-up, and the one that I've enabled is GitHub, and this one's free. So this I think might be a nice one for you guys to use, and it'll let you attach your branches, commits, issues, and pull requests to your cards. So that's pretty cool. Yeah, I like that one. You can have a look through at the other ones. Some of these are free and some of them are not. And I had to click on them to try to add them to see if I try to add another one. Like I liked, what other ones did I look at? There was, see there's one for Jira, which I'm interested in what this one is. Eliminate context switching. I reach my power-up limits. If you try to add another one, it'll say you already have one. Too bad. So if I disable this one, so you can disable them, and that'll open it up for you to add another one. So I'm interested in what this one does. So it doesn't tell me anything else. Eliminate context switching and ensures every member of your team is always on the same page. So let's see what that gets us. If I go back to my board, come on. If I go back, I'll close it. If I go back to my board and I click on one of these, and you can see the power up will show up here, and I click on that. So yeah, that's not very helpful. So it'll let me attach a Jira issue. Now if I were using Jira, I wouldn't be using Trello, so I thought maybe it made it more like Jira, but that's not what it does. So if I go back to power-ups, then I can click on enable to see which one's enabled, and I can disable that one. So there are a few that are interesting to me under here. I looked at the Agile Tools one, but it's a paid one. There's a burn down, which I don't know if that one's paid or not. There was another one that I liked, but I like the GitHub one better. There's Scrum by Vince. Right. Let's see what this one is. So it says So you might want to spend a little bit of time just looking at these power-ups to see, oh, looks, it's French. Clear naming convention for your sprint board, sprint status, track your sprints burned down in real time. Let's just have a look at what it lets us do. Oh, it didn't actually add it. Oh, I bet it's a paid one. It says it's enabled, but I didn't see anything on the card. Oh, here we go. Scrum by events. Create your board, add your lists and cards. You're ready to set up your sprint. So it's got a YouTube video that tells you how to set up a sprint. Okay, so we won't look at that right now. I'm going to put it back to the Git one. So you can see you can enable and disable these. So you can have a play around before you commit to one and see which one. But I think the GitHub one is probably going to be a nice one to have. So one of the things that you have to show for this project is you have to show that you've used an Agile workflow, and so you can have a look at the rubric to see what that means. But basically it means you can show that you've got work planned, that it's assigned to people, that it's estimated, that you're meeting regularly, so you're taking some meeting minutes, that you're going back to the client, so you have some meeting minutes from that, and that you also have to demonstrate for the source control perspective that you have multiple commits and branches and pull requests, and that those are being done by different team members. So you can demonstrate all of that with your Trello board if you use the Git power up. So that's why I think it might be a good choice to use. But have a look though and see if you think there's another one. And if you think that there's another one that looks better, then let us know. So another thing that I'll show you here is that you can create checklists also in your cards. So I created a checklist and I called it subtasks. And then on that checklist I put things like design, so design for this particular story, maybe some low-level design that needs to be done, tests, wireframes, so things like that could be considered subtasks of a particular thing that you're going to code, and then you could put a time estimate next to it. So this is all, you know, and the reason that you do all of this is to try to get as much an idea as you can about the work that needs to be done and how long it's going to take, so that when you divide the work up, you know, you have some level of comfort that that person's going to be able to complete that work in that amount of time, and overall for the project all the MVP work is going to get done. So you might start to do this planning work and realize, okay, this is way more work than we can do in 3 weeks. Like, we've already estimated that this is going to take us 30 days. So we've got to scale something, we've got to pull something out, we've got to scale this back. So do upfront planning before you start, and then at the end of each sprint period, look at it again, because the time it took you to do things will change. So some things may take less time than you thought it did. The way that you could use this is, I added a comment that said initial estimate for this whole story is 4 hours. And then I added Matt to the task as the team member, so that that's assigned to Matt to do, and then he added a comment saying that it was done in 2 hours. And so as you complete the subtasks, you can check them off, and it'll show you the percentage of those being done. When you can set a due date on tasks, so you can, this is sort of how you can do your sprint planning. So by setting a due date, 3 days from now, maybe that's the end of sprint 1. 3 days after that might be the end of sprint 2. So you can look at, there's a calendar, but I think it's another power up. No, maybe not. Is it over here? There's maybe the calendar is a power up, which is a little bit sad. So these are just some ideas for how you can use Trello. Now, when something, this shouldn't be in the backlog, this should actually be maybe in review. So as you decide, you define these user stories, you put estimates on them. Maybe this is a high priority one, and so we add that label, and then maybe we say there's an initial estimate of 2 hours. So this is all in the planning period. You write a description about this particular task, and then maybe we add a checklist to it, and in that checklist we'll have maybe we want to do a little bit more design, and we'll spend 30 minutes on that. And then we want to do some write tests if we're going to do test-driven development, and we say that's going to be 2 hours. 2 hours is my total estimate, so it better not take that long. We'll say 30 minutes. And then maybe to code, we'll say it's going to take 1 hour, and those are going to be the tasks for this particular user story. And so we're not considering the review time and everything else. So when you're doing your overall sprint planning, even though we're saying this particular task is going to take 2 hours, you want to factor in that it's also going to take maybe 30 minutes for someone to review, to actually run the test. You want to factor in that time too when you do your sprint planning. So now maybe that I've defined that one, I can put it in the to-do list. Maybe we say that we're going to assign this one. He's my only other member right now, or maybe we'll assign this one to me, and we'll take Matt off. We'll assign this one to me, and so we'll know that this one's assigned to me. When I'm ready to work on it, when I actually start working on it, I put it in the in progress. So then you've got a view here of what you've got in workflow. You'd have a bunch of stuff in the to-do. So everything that you decide is in the MPV after you do your initial planning is going to go into the to-do area, okay? And then at the start of each sprint, this stuff should be assigned to people. If not, then you need to do the work of assigning it to people. And then as you as a developer start working on something, you put it in progress. Now let's say that I completed this. So I checked everything off. And maybe I say completed in 3 hours. Maybe it took longer than the 2 hours estimated. And now maybe I want Matt to review it. So maybe I add Matt to it, and then I have it stuck in the in review column. So when things are in the in review column, as a developer, you're looking for, is there stuff in this in review column? If so, I should take some time to look at it too. So that's also a part of your work as a developer, is to look at what other people have done and spend some time reviewing it. Now if you've got the GitHub attachment here, then it could be really nice because you can attach a particular commit to it. And so then the developer reviewing can look and say, okay, this is the commit that I want to look at for this particular review, and you know exactly what to go look at to review. So I think that's a really nice feature of this GitHub power-up too. So that was a lot of stuff. Let's go back to this for a minute and talk about it and answer some questions. So we prioritize and estimate at the very start. Everything that we agree is in the MVP, we stick in the to-do. And then when we start the first sprint, we drag things into in progress that are being worked on in that sprint. We add subtasks, and each developer can do that for the thing they're working on, okay? And as you complete those subtasks, check them off. So why do you do all this? It's so the whole team has visibility about what's going on. It makes it really easy to talk at your stand-up. You just look at the board together, and you're like, all right, this is in progress. What do you have to say about that? Janelle, what's going on with that one? And I'll say, oh, actually, I'm done. I'm going to put it in review. Okay, yep, so somebody's going to review that next. So it makes it really easy to look at what's going on with everyone, and it makes your stand-ups go by a lot quicker if you've got it organized in the board. Once you've got things in your to-do list, then you design, develop, test, and review, and then move it to done. So at the start of the development sprint, you know who's going to work on which stories in the to-do. You move them to in progress. Once the story is designed, coded, and tested, it moves to in review. Each developer should be monitoring the in review queue for other team members' work, and you can decide how you handle that. You know, do you just want one person to review it? Do you want everyone on the team to review it? Do you want at least 2 people to review it? So you make a decision about that, and you consider the trade-offs. If everybody has to review everything, of course, that takes more of your time, but might result in more robust changes. You know, maybe you have to consider how good is our testing. If we don't have a lot of testing, then review becomes more important. If you've got good testing built in, then review might be a little bit less important. So those are all things that you need to talk about and negotiate as a team about how you're going to handle it. And then you agree on something, and then you work according to that agreement. Once you have completed the review process on a particular story, then you move it to done. Now, at the end of your sprint cycle, all the things that are in done should be things that you can show to your client. So now you've got a nice list of things that you know you can show to your client. It's all organized for you. So then you say, okay, these are the things we're going to show this week. Now, at the end of the second sprint, you'll have more things in there, but they can be listed in an order. You can, like I said, you could add another list here if you wanted to. You could say signed off or something, or approved. So something you've already shown to the client. Maybe if you've already showed it to them, you add it to this list. So then you know that what's in done after that sprint, you're only going to show this stuff. Now, you might still have to show the stuff that was already approved, but you know that these are the new things that you want to show to the client. Now, let's say that you show something to the client and they're like, okay, actually after seeing that, I really want this other thing that you already did to work slightly differently. Well, that'll result in a new story being created over here that gets put into do, that'll move along, and then it will eventually end up in the done list, and you'll show it to the client, maybe at the end of the next sprint. So at the end of each sprint, when you've shown things to the client and you've gotten feedback, you have to go back here and look at this, what's in your to-do. Does this all still make sense? Do we have to add something else to this? Do we need to take anything out? Is there anything that we thought was backlog? And what's in backlog is like sort of the nice to haves, the things that we'll do if we get time to. Is there anything there that's suddenly become more important that we need to move in the to-do? Okay. Now, if you've got things organized this way, it also means that if a particular developer is blocked, so I've got something that's in my to-do and it's assigned to me, but blocked because waiting on problem with DB setup or something. And so maybe you add a label to it. Maybe you create a label that's called blocked. I did that wrong. That's okay. I maybe want it to be orange. I'm going to remove this label. I don't know what just happened there. Maybe you add a label called blocked. And so it's in to-do, but I know that it's blocked, and so I'm going to look and see, is there anything else in the to-do that I can work on? That's my first question, and if there is, then I take that one. I put my name on it, and I do the work. If there's nothing in here that I can do, maybe because everybody else that we've already decided that other people are going to do those things, then I might look in the backlog to see if there's something that I can pull in. But if you're blocked, you would have talked about it in your stand-up, and you would have probably decided as a team, oh, okay, well, I have this thing, you can work on that, and I'll work on this other thing, So that's why stand-ups are important, because they're going to be things that come up, and to be the most productive as a team, when you're working on this tight of a schedule in this way, then you want to talk about it when things get stuck to work out what's the best next thing for you to work on. So the way that I'm using this board, is it making sense to you guys? So there's there's not a lot that you can do here, but you can set a due date. You can create attachments. So you can attach a link. You can attach things from OneDrive or Google Drive from your computer. So that's a way that you can attach things like ERDs or flowcharts, or if you write a design up in a Word doc or something that you want to attach, whatever. Or if you have pictures, maybe you were drawing on a whiteboard, and together as a team you just take a picture of that and attach the picture to save time. That's fine too. So being able to attach files, I think, is pretty handy. Set a due date to control when like sort of setting sprint time periods. I think I would use due date for that. And use labels. So you have to actually look at things to see what the labels say, but if you decide on some color conventions as a team, then that could make it more useful at a glance. Yeah, so that's pretty much it. I've just got things written out here, but I think I've talked to most of it. So make sure when you do your stand-ups, you can actually reflect everything in your Trello board. You can add comments directly to the cards instead of having separate meeting notes. If you're using Trello, you could just put comments directly in your cards on your Trello board, and that would serve as meeting minutes, okay, to show that you're having discussions, you're having stand-ups, and you're taking note of what's happening in the comments. So just add comments to your cards, okay, when you're taking actions as a result of your stand-ups. For your client meetings, you could even do the same if you wanted to. You could use your Trello board for the client meetings, and you could add comments directly to the cards. You could create comment cards if you wanted to, So if you don't want to, I would be tempted myself to use the Trello board for everything, to manage the project, just to keep it all in one place. And then as far as submitting your project, you just, make sure that we're in your team and can see your Trello board, and you can just point out in a brief summary things like minutes from our stand-up meetings or comments on our cards in the Trello board. Minutes from our client meetings are stored as cards or stored as comments on the cards. Like, you just have to let us know what you did, but I would be really tempted to just use the board. So do you guys know how to create a team and stuff and add members to the team? It's fairly straightforward. So you can create a project. You can make your project private, and then you can add members to a project, and you can have multiple boards in a project if you wanted to, but I think it's going to be a lot more manageable with one board. And then once the team members are in your project, then they're really easy to add to cards. So they just show up here in the list of board members, so you can just select them. There are things you can do, like if you've got your board organized one way already and you want to reorganize it, you can do things like move all cards in this list. So if you decide to structure your list differently, maybe right now you have your list structured by feature or story, and you want to structure it in workflow, then you can take all of them, which is what I did with this board when I started. So I took Matt's original board, and then I just selected on each one of them, I just moved all the cards into backlog to start. So I created the backlog to do, in progress done, or in review done, and then I moved all the cards originally into backlog. And then you should also order these in order of priority. So this, one way I think that the most straightforward way to prioritize things is just to have them listed in the priority order. So Trello makes it really easy to do that. You just slide them around. So you all agree that what's at the top of this list is the most important. So that's what you should take first, if it's not assigned.
Just as a tip, you can also click on the color things there, just so you can see what
Nice. There you go. Sweet.
whether it's high priority or what.
For sure. For sure. That's awesome. All right. So questions? Do you guys? Yeah.
Max people that you have on the Trello board?
It's a good question.
200.
It's like max members.
Or just like what would be too much?
Look, so yeah, as far as like what makes sense, if I were using Trello and I were working on a large project, I would add all my stakeholders as members. So, I would, now if you're working directly with a client, maybe you want to expose your Trello board to your client, maybe you don't. I guess it depends on the relationship you have with your client and the nature of that relationship. But you might want your client, though, to have access to your Trello board. Now, does Trello let you control, does it have roles? Like, you wouldn't want your client to come in and, like, move stuff around on you, necessarily. That might be bad.
Yeah, because Matt sent our Trello board to us, it was read-only.
Right, so maybe you can make your client a read-only. A read-only.
You can click on the team members, so JB or F.
Right. Oh, there you go. Beautiful. So then I would probably be tempted, unless there were some reason not to, I would want my client to be a member and to be a read-only member. All the developers, if you have testers, in the purposes of this class, you can make the instructors read-only members of your board. You can wait to do that if you wanted to, but yeah, you can do that, and that way we can give you feedback. So you can say, oh, I'm not sure about this. We can have a look and say, oh, I'd suggest you do it this way. So I think however many members are on your team. Now, typically, what we would do at SAP is our Agile teams, we have sort of an ideal size of 7 to 10 team members on the products that we worked on. So that was sort of our ideal Scrum size. But it depends on what you're working on, It depends on what you're working on. So you guys won't have that many team members,
No.
No. And you only have 3 weeks. So, but it's just, it's a chance to practice all these things. That's really the purpose of this assignment, is for you to practice all the things that we've talked about. The technical things, and also the process things. Any other questions? All good? All right. Cool. Well, I would definitely encourage you to start working on this. You can, even if you just build in the list and start throwing stuff into the backlog as you define it, and as you throw stuff into the backlog, If it's broken down into small chunks, then you can do things like estimate the time it's going to take. You know, you can create some checklists with subtasks on them. You might even, you know, start assigning things to people. And it just is a way to visualize your planning, which I think is really helpful to do. All right, thanks, guys.